It took just one phone call. 3 hours later, a family's entire reputation was in ruins. My neighbor Karen believed she was being clever when she contacted the authorities to go after my grandfather, all because he wouldn't bow down to her little HOA empire. But what she didn't know was that the quiet, gray-haired man she was targeting had something far more powerful than anything she had ever held in her life. And the moment that power surfaced, her smirk disappeared, replaced by shock that rippled across our entire neighborhood. This is a story about arrogance, abuse of authority, and a downfall that no one saw coming. Strap in and tell me where you're watching from, because the truth here is more jaw-dropping than fiction. It all began on an otherwise ordinary morning. I was out on the front porch, newspaper in hand at the Denver Post, absently thumbing the old flip phone in my pocket, not out of anxiety, but because I was expecting an important call from a longtime friend. The autumn breeze had that crisp edge that reminded me why I'd chosen Colorado for retirement. Everything felt calm until Vivian Cross came striding down Maple Grove like a military officer inspecting her command. As usual, she was equipped with her enforcement gear, a clipboard thick with documents, a precision laser measuring tool that probably cost more than some people's mortgages, and her ever-ready camera for capturing every supposed infraction in our peaceful neighborhood. But what Vivian didn't realize was that I'd already been in quiet contact with Agent Martinez the day before, not to call in a favor, but to spring a trap. "Mr. Reeves," she barked, her tone high-pitched enough to set off dogs across town, "your gate still measures 4.2 feet. That's a direct violation of HOA code, which limits fences and barriers to 4 feet flat." She brandished that measuring device like it was a court order, her polished nails tapping impatiently against the plastic. I folded my newspaper and looked up at her with the kind of steady calm that comes from dealing with people much more dangerous than a neighborhood control freak. "Vivian," I said evenly, "I've explained this before. My property predates your HOA by over a decade. Your rules don't apply to me." Her face flushed, that all too familiar shade of red that signaled she was about to take things way too far. I could almost hear the calculations racing through her head as she plotted her next escalation. True to form, Vivian reached into her bag of theatrics and slammed a bulky manila envelope onto my table like she was starring in a courtroom drama. "A legal notice from Hardman Associates," she declared loudly enough for half the block to hear. "You have 24 hours to pay a $500 fine and sign a compliance agreement, or face a $15,000 civil lawsuit for endangering community safety." I took the papers, giving them a quick scan. My years of experience made the inconsistencies pop out immediately, details that would slip right past the average homeowner. This wasn't about neighborhood rules or unpaid dues. Buried in the legalese were references to partial property rights transfers, to something no legitimate HOA would dare demand. Vivian wasn't just collecting finesse, she was trying to carve off pieces of people's homes. Inside, I heard my granddaughter Emma's video call get interrupted by the commotion. I glanced through the window and saw her worried expression. She was 16. Had been living with me since the tragic accident that claimed her parents 3 years ago. I'd sworn to give her the peace and security she deserved, but sometimes, keeping the peace means standing your ground. And she was about to see a side of her grandfather she hadn't known existed. "Don't worry, sweetheart," I called gently through the screen door, my voice just soft enough to stay private. "Your old grandpa's been through worse than this." What I didn't say, at least not yet, was that I recognized the name on that legal threat. Hardman. Marcus Hardman. A name from a case that had haunted my final years before retirement. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed Mrs. Peterson from next door at her window, phone raised, and not just watching, but recording, like she'd been doing for months. She and her husband had spent the last 2 years draining their retirement fund to pay off Vivian's finesse, most of which were likely fabricated. But fear kept them quiet, fear of a legal battle they couldn't afford. That's how people like Vivian operate, preying on the vulnerable, the hesitant, the ones who won't fight back. They squeeze until there's nothing left to take. "You've got until tomorrow, Mr. Reeves," Vivian sneered, her voice oozing smug confidence. "Otherwise, the police will be involved, and trust me, this neighborhood has no patience for rule breakers." I've already contacted Channel 7 News. They're eager to cover the story of a dangerous old man threatening community peace. With that, She spun on her heel and stormed back toward her house, her measuring tool bouncing like some kind of twisted trophy. But I noticed something she probably didn't think I'd catch. Her hands were shaking, and that told me all I needed to know. Real criminals are the serious ones I used to chase. Don't show fear. They walk through fire without flinching. Vivian was scared. That meant she was tangled up in something far bigger than HOA politics. As she vanished into her home, I flipped open my phone and scrolled through old contacts until I reached one I hadn't dialed in over 6 months. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the street. Porch lights flickered on, windows glowed. Families went about their usual routines, completely unaware of the storm brewing around them. At first, I thought I understood Vivian's tactics of petty power grabs and trumped-up violations, but after combing through those legal papers again, a darker reality emerged. That lawyer she referenced, Marcus Hartman, wasn't just a local bottom feeder looking for a payday. He was the Marcus Hartman, the same one I'd pursued for 3 relentless years before I turned in my badge. The one who always stayed a step ahead. The one who specialized in a Vivian Cross had unknowingly invited a storm. The man she had tied herself to. Marcus Hartman wasn't just a shady attorney. He was a career con artist. I knew that name well. Before I hung up my badge, he was at the center of a multi-state elder fraud case that spanned retirement communities from Nevada to Oregon. He'd stolen millions through legal loopholes, coercion, and fake documentation, and now he had resurfaced right here in my quiet Denver suburb, preying on people I considered my responsibility. The following morning, Vivian cranked up her campaign of intimidation, but this time, it wasn't her usual live stream or public confrontations. She'd changed tactics to something sneakier. By 7 a.m., nearly every pole, mailbox, and street sign within 3 blocks had been plastered with nearly 200 neon yellow flyers. Warning: dangerous resident refuses to comply with safety regulations was stamped across the top in large, bold red text. Beneath it, a blurry image of my front gate, clearly taken with a telephoto lens, attempted to frame me as a threat to the community. She made my legally compliant 4-foot fence sound like a fortress meant to endanger the neighborhood. But that wasn't the end of her media blitz. At 9 a.m. sharp, a van from the Denver Post pulled up across the street. I watched from my kitchen as Vivian launched into an animated rant for a young, visibly uncomfortable reporter. From my vantage point, I could catch snippets of her statements. Elderly man defies safety rules. Community unity at risk. The reporter scribbled notes, clearly going through the motions, but she kept looking toward my house with a raised brow. Anyone trained in reading people could see she wasn't buying what Vivian was selling. She could smell the exaggeration. By 10:30 a.m., the spectacle had escalated even further. 2 private security guards in matching Navy uniforms took positions across from my porch. They unfolded chairs and sat beneath a banner that read under HOA investigation. They looked about as thrilled as interns on trash duty, likely wondering how a job meant for real security ended up with them babysitting a senior citizen caught in a suburban turf war. Still, their presence made a statement. Cross had power, and she wasn't afraid to use it. Most people, faced with that kind of public humiliation, would have surrendered, paid the fines, signed the papers, just to make it all stop. But I knew better, and it was time to get serious. Rather than duck behind curtains like she probably expected, I threw on my coat and took a slow walk around the neighborhood. Old instincts kicked in. I took mental notes, cataloging every detail with the same precision I used back in my federal law enforcement days. What I saw unsettled me. A dozen houses had new security cameras, all oddly angled toward public areas instead of private property. At least 8 homes showed signs of freshly replaced locks, with mismatched hardware and visible gaps suggesting the homeowners hadn't initiated the changes. But the most telling evidence was in the people themselves. Quiet conversations, nervous glances, the look of folks constantly watching their backs. This place was gripped by fear. The first real talk I had was with Harold Peterson, my longtime neighbor, a retired postal worker, 72 years old, hands trembling as he passed me a bundle of papers. "Sterling," he whispered, eyes darting, "Margaret and I have been paying her for 2 years now. First it was $3,000 for painting the house the wrong shade of beige. Then another $2,000 for something she called a maintenance audit. Now she wants $5,000 more for security upgrades. His voice cracked. We've been together 48 years, never missed a payment, never had a dispute, but now, we feel like criminals in our own home. The papers were all official looking, sealed envelopes, legal jargon, and all bore the same name, Hardman Associates. When I got back to the house, Emma was sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop, a fierce look of determination on her face. "Grandpa," she said, her eyes locked on the screen, "I've been digging into this Vivian woman, and something really strange came up." She'd gotten into the neighborhood's private Facebook group. There, she found thread after thread of families dealing with nearly identical problems. 23 households, all hit with violations, all paying fines, and over $47,000 had changed hands in just 2 years. She clicked into one post. "Look at this," she said. Jake and Lisa Sullivan took out a second mortgage just to cover her penalties. Some neighbors were so afraid of her, they were quietly selling their homes and moving. What Emma found digitally lined up perfectly with what I'd uncovered on foot. This wasn't random bullying, it was targeted, strategic, and deeply calculated. But then she unearthed something even bigger, something that made my stomach drop. "Grandpa," she said, scrolling through the city's online records, "there's no official HOA registered for Maple Grove. There never has been." She turned the laptop toward me. Her fingers navigated city records like she'd done it 100 times. "She's not part of an association," Emma said. "She is the association, except it's all fake." I stared at the data address filings, homeowner registries, organizational licenses. It was all blank. Vivian Cross wasn't just overstepping her authority. She had no authority at all. She had fabricated an entire homeowners association, collected dues and fines under false pretenses, and built a private empire on deception. And Marcus Hardman, he was the one dressing her scam up in legal clothing. That same afternoon, Vivian made her boldest move yet. She staged what she called an emergency community safety meeting right there on the sidewalk in front of my house. There were folding chairs, a portable PA system, and about 30 neighbors. Most looked uncomfortable, unsure of what they'd been dragged into. Vivian, of course, took center stage, gesturing dramatically toward my home as she lectured the crowd. "This man," she boomed, voice amplified, "has endangered our peaceful community. Children can't play outside. Property values are in jeopardy. Law-abiding citizens no longer feel safe." It was a theatrical display, enough truth to bait people in, laced with wild exaggerations. And for those unfamiliar with the full story, it probably sounded believable. But as I watched the entire scene from my living room window, one thing became crystal clear. Vivian had overplayed her hand. By dragging this circus into the public eye, she'd made a mistake, a big one. By turning her vendetta into a public spectacle, Vivian had crossed a line. In doing so, she'd drawn the kind of attention that seasoned criminals usually go out of their way to avoid. It also told me something else: she was getting desperate, escalating faster than she probably intended. I thought I had a handle on her tactics, petty threats, inflated violations, and psychological games. But when Emma showed me an email I hadn't noticed, an interview request from Channel 7 News, I realized the story was shifting. The journalist wanted to hear my version of events. That meant Vivian's narrative was starting to unravel. And with her threatening to involve law enforcement the following day, I knew she was in for a rude awakening. That would be the moment everything changed. The call that flipped our world upside down came at exactly 8:47 a.m. While Emma was getting ready for her virtual class, I was in the kitchen making coffee when I heard her cheerful voice answer the phone. Then a sudden silence. That pause made me glance over. "You have broken bar. This is Emma Reeves," she said, uncertainty creeping in. "You're looking for my grandfather. You're with the FBI?" I dropped the mug in my hand. Ceramic exploded across the linoleum, shards skittering across the floor. In over 3 decades of federal service, I'd kept my work far away from home. I never let my family get pulled into the world I'd spent years navigating. But now, that world had finally followed me here. Emma appeared in the doorway, holding the phone like it might burst into flames. Her eyes were wide, confused, scared. "Grandpa," she whispered, covering the receiver. "There's an Agent Martinez on the line. He says he needs to speak to Sterling Reeves Broken Bar. Something about the files you sent him yesterday?" I took the phone, my hand steady despite the storm that was clearly about to hit. "Martinez," I said, recognizing the voice right away. "Tell me you've had time to review what I forwarded." His reply confirmed what I'd feared. "Sterling, the routing numbers you flagged match active investigations tied to fraud rings we're tracking in Texas, California, and Nevada. We need to talk it today." I glanced over at Emma, who was frozen in place behind the kitchen island. I knew then I couldn't keep her in the dark any longer. After ending the call, she fixed me with a stare sharp enough to cut steel. "Grandpa," she said, her voice low and tight, "what is going on? Why is the FBI calling our house? What documents? And don't even think about telling me it's nothing. I am not a child." There was hurt behind her anger, and that stung deeper than anything a criminal had ever thrown at me. For the past 3 years, I'd just been Grandpa, the one who helped with math homework, the one who made pancakes every Saturday. But Emma deserved more than silence. She deserved the truth. I led her down the hall to the room she'd always assumed was just my little officia where I paid bills and kept old photos. Inside, I unlocked the cabinet that hadn't been opened in years. Files, credentials, case evidence, my badge. Her eyes widened as I handed her my identification, fingers trembling just slightly as she held it up. "You're Broken Bar FBI?" she asked quietly. "Like, real deal federal agent FBI, not retired rent-a-cop with a story?" I lowered myself into the old desk chair and pulled out a stack of well-preserved folders. "I was, sweetheart, 30 years in financial crimes, specializing in elder fraud and organized theft rings." I paused. "I stepped away after your parents passed. I wanted to give you the stable, quiet life you deserved." But as I began to explain the details surrounding Marcus Hartman, the same man whose name kept popping up on Vivian's fake legal notice, Emma's confusion gave way to realization, then to something else. Focus. Hartman hadn't just been another case. He was the one who slipped through my fingers. Between 2018 and 2021, he masterminded a network of phony HOAs and bogus management companies, stealing more than $2 million from elderly homeowners across multiple states. He left behind nothing but fake business names, forged records, and victims who couldn't prove a thing. I showed Emma the photos, the financial printouts, the statements from those who'd been exploited. "This isn't just some sketchy lawyer," I told her as she flipped through files on my tablet. "He's a professional predator. He knows how to manipulate trust and steal everything people own." Then came the clincher. I revealed the surveillance equipment I'd been using quietly for 2 weeks. Hidden cameras around the property had captured hours of footage, including 3 distinct meetings between Vivian and a man matching Hartman's description. I showed Emma the stills, one from a Starbucks off Fax Avenue Broken Bar, another from Cherry Creek Mala Broken Bar, and most damning of all, one from the backlot of the Wells Fargo Bank where several of Vivian's fined victims had been spotted withdrawing large sums of cash. Emma stared at the images with laser-like focus. It was eerie how much she reminded me of myself when I was her age. "This isn't just about a power trip," I told her. "This is organized crime." And I walked straight into the heart of their next scheme. But instead of recoiling, Emma cracked her knuckles and nodded. "Okay," she said, straightening up. "So we catch them, right? You said he slipped away before. But he's here now. We can't just let him keep draining people like Mr. and Mrs. Peterson." Her fire made me proud and nervous. I didn't want her tangled in any of this, but I could see it in her eyes as she was already in. Without waiting for permission, she dove back into her laptop. She was cross-referencing addresses, pulling public records, overlaying everything against the bank data I'd collected. By midday, we had confirmation. Vivian had been operating under no fewer than 4 business aliases, all of them linked to bank accounts with suspicious deposit spikes. Her digital talent and my investigative experience combined like clockwork, and the picture that began to form was more complex and far more dangerous than either of us had anticipated. This wasn't just about Maple Grove anymore. We'd stumbled onto something much, much bigger. We had stumbled upon what looked like the central command of a large-scale scam operation stretching across multiple states, specifically preying on retirement communities. "Look at this," Grandpa Emma said, pointing at a string of financial activity on her monitor. "If these figures are accurate, they've siphoned nearly $130,000 from just our neighborhood over the last year and a half." That same afternoon, Vivian ramped things up in a way that revealed her growing desperation. She'd hired a private investigator to dig into my personal history, and by mid-afternoon, ugly whispers were spreading in accusations that I might be a registered sex offender or hiding some kind of criminal record. It was a textbook smear campaign meant to undermine my credibility before I could fully uncover her scheme, but it also signaled that she felt cornered. The fact she resorted to such extreme tactics suggested that Marcus Hartman was pressuring her to wrap things up quickly, probably because my involvement had begun to rattle him. The reality of our situation hit hard when Emma showed me texts circulating among her classmates' parents, questioning if it was even safe for their children to walk by our home. That's when I knew we were nearly out of time. Everything snapped into focus when one of my hidden surveillance cameras captured a chilling scene later that evening. Marcus Hartman showed up at Vivian's house, but he wasn't alone. The man with him was someone I instantly recognized from past case files. He'd been linked to elder exploitation scams in no fewer than 6 states. What made it worse was what Hartman was carrying: a manila envelope, the kind used for confidential personal files. And I had no doubt it contained information identifying exactly who I was. Through my telephoto lens, I watched as Emma began running the plates on their vehicle and cross-referencing them with federal records. It became clear, when Vivian followed through on her threat to call the police tomorrow, this wouldn't be treated like a petty neighborhood spat. This would escalate into something that could either dismantle Marcus Hartman's criminal network or put Emma and me in more danger than I had ever imagined facing in retirement. Vivian's final power play began promptly at 6 a.m. Her voice echoed from her open windows, loud enough to carry down the street. "I need immediate police assistance," she declared into the phone with theatrical flair, as if performing for a live audience. "A resident here is concealing his identity and poses a direct threat to community safety. He's been intimidating others, ignoring legal directives, and I have strong reason to believe he's hiding a criminal past." I listened from the kitchen, almost impressed by her dedication to the role. Every word she uttered was strategically designed for maximum dramatic effect, likely amplified by the cameras she'd surely arranged to capture her supposed moment of vindication. But Vivian wasn't relying solely on 911. As she staged her emergency call, her laptop was simultaneously spamming emails to every member of the Denver City Council. Attached was a so-called petition with 31 names, demanding an urgent investigation into my background and right to reside in the neighborhood. The petition itself was a masterclass in bureaucratic manipulation stuffed with official-sounding jargon about residential compliance checks and community safety assessments. It gave her personal crusade a false air of civic duty. Worst of all, many of the signatures came from neighbors who'd been misled into thinking they were merely supporting safety upgrades in the area. By 7:30, she'd mobilized her biggest crowd yet. 47 people lined the sidewalk in front of our home, many holding mass-produced signs with slogans like "Protect Our Families" and "Transparency in the Community." The speed and scale of the demonstration clearly pointed to extensive planning and professional coordination. I recognized Hartman's fingerprints all over Ida, from the carefully curated messaging to the precise legal framing of their complaints. But what stood out most was the unease on many faces. Several attendees looked unsure, shifting uncomfortably and glancing around like they weren't even certain what they were rallying against. Inside, Emma was preparing for whatever might come. She adjusted multiple camera setups, capturing every angle of the crowd and scene. Her digital instincts were spot on. She called it evidence insurance, just in case things spiraled out of control. Meanwhile, I was dealing with a far more immediate issue. Vivian had managed to get the entire block's electricity shut off by filing what she claimed was an emergency safety report with the city utilities office. As I sat in the dimness of my living room, watching the crowd outside swell, I felt something rare in uncertainty. Despite decades of federal law enforcement experience, I wasn't sure if I prepared enough for what was about to unfold. Then came the real gut punch. Vivian's private investigator stepped forward and began handing out what he claimed were official documents proving I had a hidden criminal history and had been living under false pretenses. The documents were forged, but they looked legitimate enough to sway a crowd already bracing for scandal. I watched in disbelief as neighbors I chatted with warmly over the past 3 years began murmuring to one another, confused expressions hardening into suspicion, then transforming into something darker. It was a perfectly executed character he'd meant to isolate and discredit me before law enforcement even showed up. When the police finally arrived at 8:15, 3 cruisers rolled into view, their flashing lights casting red and blue reflections on windows throughout the neighborhood. As Officers Johnson, Rodriguez, and Captain Hayes stepped out of their vehicles into a scene that resembled a civil protest more than a neighborhood complaint, I felt the full weight of every choice that had led to this moment. Vivian stood at a makeshift podium, gripping a microphone like a suburban revolutionary addressing her army. "Thank you all for being here," she declared to the crowd and the multiple cameras capturing every moment. "Today, we reclaim our neighborhood from those who use fear and deception against honest, law-abiding families." Captain Hayes walked up to my door, the weary professionalism of a man who'd spent 2 decades resolving domestic calls written all over his face. Yet behind his polite demeanor, I saw the doubt. He clearly wasn't buying the full story that brought him here. "Mr. Reeves," he greeted as I opened the door, "we've received several reports about possible residential code violations and some claims involving falsified documents or background inconsistencies. Mind if we talk?" His voice was calm but assertive. I respected that he was approaching the situation with a sense of due process instead of instantly assuming I was guilty based on whatever narrative Vivian had spun. Still, I couldn't ignore the growing crowd behind him. Their presence silently urging a fast conclusion, and quick outcomes rarely work out well for the accused. "Captain Hayes," I said, stepping onto the porch so everyone could hear me, "I'm happy to talk, but before we go any further, there are a few things you should know. I have a feeling that once you understand the full picture, you're going to want backup." His confused expression was exactly what I expected, but before he could say anything, Mrs. Peterson stepped out of her house, carrying something that drained the color from Vivian's fascia, a shoebox stuffed with audio tapes, forged legal documents, and financial records she'd been compiling in secret for months. "Officer," Mrs. Peterson called out, her voice stronger than I'd heard in years, "before you believe another word from that woman, you need to see what she's been doing. I've got 6 months worth of recordings proving she's been blackmailing and defrauding families across the street." Murmurs rippled through the crowd as she approached, holding her evidence like a sword. Vivian, meanwhile, was frantically tapping her phone, clearly trying to erase something, even as she shouted objections that no one was acknowledging anymore. But what truly shifted the energy was the arrival of an unmarked sedan that rolled in behind the police cruisers. Agent Martinez stepped out, his federal ID hanging visibly around his neck. I watched Captain Hayes's entire posture shift. This was no longer just a neighborhood squabble. "Captain Hayes," Martinez called out as he neared, "I'm Agent Martinez with the FBI Financial Crimes Division. We've been working closely with Mr. Reeves on an ongoing case, and it looks like today's complaints are tied directly into that investigation." Silence settled over the crowd as the realization of federal involvement hit like a cold wave. Vivian's confident mask disintegrated into raw panic. Then, just as I thought things were calming down, a sleek black luxury sedan appeared at the end of the block, rolling toward us like a predator stalking its prey. Through the tinted passenger window, I spotted a face that stopped me cold. DeMarcus Hartman, the man I'd been tracking for 3 years, had decided to personally insert himself into the situation. As the car edged closer, I knew everything we'd planned for was about to be tested in real time. What began as a neighborhood standoff was now turning into a full-scale federal takedown. But Hartman's presence meant we were just entering the danger zone. My granddaughter and I were standing at the epicenter of something that could either shut down his empire or open the door to threats far more dangerous than fraud. So I ask you, what would you have done if you were in Sterling's shoes? Standing there with a federal criminal pulling up while your neighbor still thought you might be the villain? Share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Sterling did the right thing revealing his FBI identity to Emma? I'm Jason Miller reporting from Chicago, and let me tell you what happened next. That was the moment my 30 years in federal service had led to. Time seemed to crystallize. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the worn leather case I'd carried through decades of field work, placing my FBI badge and credentials on the porch table in full view of every camera, neighbor, and police officer. The reaction was instant and electric. Captain Hayes instinctively took a step back, clearly recognizing the badge. A few neighbors audibly gasped. And Vivian? She went from pale to nearly translucent in seconds. Agent Sterling Reeves, Hayes said, his voice full of recognition and astonishment. I remember you from the Denver Housing Fraud Task Force back in 2018. You led Operation Clean House. The noisy crowd was now silent, as if in a courtroom or a cathedral. Agent Martinez stepped up, confirming what was already obvious. Sterling Reeves, he announced to the stunned gathering, 30 years with the FBI Financial Crimes Division, expert in elder scams and organized financial rings. Mr. Reeves has been collaborating with our office on a case closely tied to the accusations made against him today. That announcement rippled through the crowd like a physical shockwave. People exchanged glances, some confused, some embarrassed. The protest signs that had once demanded my arrest were now slowly being lowered. A few people near the back slipped away, likely realizing they'd been duped into supporting something they didn't fully understand. Vivian's downfall was nothing short of cinematic. She stared at my badge like it was some sort of relic, her mouth opening and closing without sound. Her ever-present clipboard dropped to the pavement, followed by her laser measurer, which bounced before coming to a stop at the curb. No, she whispered, barely loud enough to be heard. You're not supposed to be broken, bar. This isn't possible. She stumbled backward, her designer heels clacking against the concrete until her knees gave out, collapsing into a heap of overpriced clothing and shattered pride. Emma, watching through the front window, would later say the whole thing looked like a scene from a movie, right down to the golden light of the rising sun. But Marcus Hartman wasn't about to let his criminal empire crumble without a fight. He stepped out of the black car with the kind of swagger that said one thing loud and clear: game on. Hartman still clung to the hope that he could bluff his way out of trouble. Stepping forward with confidence, he introduced himself to Captain Hayes. I'm Marcus Hartman, representing Miss Cross as her legal counsel, he declared, flashing his credentials with theatrical flair. This reeks of federal overreach. You're intimidating my client without just cause. I demand to know the legal authority under which this investigation is being carried out. His tone was commanding, the kind honed by years of wielding legal jargon to confuse and pressure others. But he made a critical mistake. The moment he gave his name, Agent Martinez advanced, handcuffs ready. Marcus Hartman, Martinez said with a note of grim satisfaction, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit mail and wire fraud, as well as orchestrating a theft ring targeting elderly victims. You have the right to remain silent, though I imagine you'll find that right quite useful today. Hartman's transformation was instantaneous. The swaggering attorney dissolved, replaced by a man who had just realized that years of dodging federal agents had finally caught up with him. As Martinez began reciting his rights, I noticed Vivian, now regaining consciousness in the back of the ambulance, her dazed eyes sharpening just in time to witness her partner being cuffed and taken away. While paramedics attended to Vivian, I handed over the evidence Emma and I had spent weeks compiling to Captain Hayes and Agent Martinez. The 3 binders we'd put together told a far uglier and broader story than even I had anticipated. 8 phony bank accounts, over $127,000 siphoned from 23 local families, and documents linking the operation to similar schemes across a dozen states. As I laid everything out, I could see the gravity of the situation dawning on both officers. Mrs. Peterson arrived next, carrying her box of audio recordings and adding them to the mounting stack of damning evidence, material that guaranteed federal charges would stick for both Hartman and Vivian. The community's reaction was a mix of relief, fury, and deep sorrow. As neighbors started to grasp the extent of the betrayal, Harold Peterson stepped forward, his voice quivering with emotion. "My wife and I gave her $5,000 over 2 years to Broken Bar because we thought we had no choice," he said, tears rolling down his lined cheeks. "We were scared of what would happen if we didn't pay. We were scared to have guests over, to tend to our own garden, always wondering what she'd punish us for next." His confession broke the dam. One after another, neighbors began sharing stories of being financially bled and emotionally bullied. Jake Sullivan, the young father who'd refinanced his home just to pay Vivian's fees, voiced what many were thinking. "We believed her because she looked official, because she had lawyers and paperwork, and we didn't know any better." How do you stand up to someone who claims to be the law, when you don't even understand the law? His words cut to the core of how the fraud had been so effective. Vivian and Hartman had engineered a false structure of authority complete with legal theater and intimidation to exploit people's instinct to obey and avoid conflict. As Vivian, now more alert but still woozy, was helped into the ambulance, she tried to mount one last defense. "I was protecting this community," she called out feebly, the power gone from her voice. "Everything I did was legal, fully documented." But no one was buying it anymore. The evidence was irrefutable, and more than that, the victims finally had the courage to speak out. After 2 long years, they were free from her grip. The ambulance doors shut, carrying away someone who had once ruled the neighborhood through fear and now just another defendant in a federal case. Despite the justice we'd achieved, I sensed the fight was far from over. Agent Martinez quietly pulled me aside as the crowd began to thin out. What he told me confirmed my worst suspicions. The documents retrieved from Hartman's car pointed to Maple Grove being just one small piece in a much larger scheme. "Sterling," he said softly, "we're seeing links to similar operations in 47 communities across 12 states. This isn't just about what happened here, it's about taking down a nationwide criminal network that's been targeting the elderly for years." Looking around at my neighbors, finally freed from years of fear, I realized our little victory was merely the beginning. This was the opening salvo in a much bigger battle against organized elder fraud. The scale of what we'd uncovered hit home when, at exactly 2:30 that afternoon, Agent Martinez's phone rang. I watched his expression turn from relief to deep concern as he listened. When he hung up, he approached me with a look that said everything was about to change. "That was Director Williams from Washington," he said, guiding me away from the crowd. "The intel we pulled from Hartman's vehicle confirms that your Maple Grove incident is linked to 47 other fraudulent setups across a dozen states. This may be the largest elder fraud ring the Bureau has ever seen." Emma, nearby and still filming, caught enough of the conversation to grasp the implications. She approached with her laptop open, her face a mix of excitement and alarm. "Grandpa," she said, her tone edged with urgency, "I've been cross-referencing the bank routing numbers from Vivian's files with publicly reported scams. There are clear connections to communities in California, Texas, Nevada, Arizona and 8 other states. The total amount of Broken Bar, the total amount stolen wasn't just $127,000, it exceeded $12.8 million, taken from nearly 2,000 families." Emma's investigative work uncovered information that would normally take an entire federal task force weeks to compile. I was overwhelmed, proud of her brilliance, but deeply uneasy about how far we were plunging into risky territory. Everything shifted at 3:15 p.m. with a phone call from Director Williams himself. I hadn't heard from him since my retirement ceremony 3 years ago. His voice immediately transported me back to cases that had consumed entire chapters of my life. "Sterling," he said without any small talk, "we need you back, not for good, just as the lead consultant on Operation Neighborhood Shield. You're the only one who ever got this close to dismantling Hartman's network. And more importantly, the victims trust you. You're the only one they'll fully open up to." The weight of his request felt like an old uniform settling back onto my shoulders. I glanced at Emma, knowing this choice would pull us right back into the danger I thought we'd left behind. But Emma made the decision for both of us. "Grandpa," she said, having overheard everything, You have to do it. There are nearly 2,000 families out there dealing with the same nightmare as the Petersons. You understand how these criminals work and they need that." Her words struck a deep chord. In that moment, I saw not just my granddaughter, but a young woman with an unshakable moral compass. She wouldn't let me turn my back, even if stepping up again put us in harm's way. Vivian Cross's interrogation exposed the full extent of the operation's cruelty and complexity. At the downtown FBI field office, Agent Martinez and I sat across from her as she finally cracked. "Marcus Hardman and Richard Blackstone recruited me a year and a half ago," she confessed through tears, her earlier defiance replaced with despair. "They told me it was easy money just collecting fees from people who could afford them. But when I tried to quit after the first month, they showed me photos of my son Tommy at his college in Boulder. They knew everything: his class schedule, dorm room number, even his girlfriend's name." Her terror was unmistakable. It became clear she'd been victimized, just like the residents she had helped exploit. Later that evening, Tommy Cross arrived at the field office, a 19-year-old college student who had lived under invisible threat for over a year without understanding why. "They never said anything to me directly," he told Agent Martinez and me, "but I always felt watched. Someone was always nearby, at the coffee shop, outside the dorm, even at my soccer games." Mom never explained, but I knew she was scared every time I called. His account supported Vivian's claims. Hardman and Blackstone kept their operatives obedient through targeted intimidation of their families, making escape nearly impossible. What followed was the largest coordinated federal action against elder fraud in U.S. history. At precisely 6:00 a.m., FBI teams executed simultaneous raids across 12 states, targeting 31 separate locations linked to the Hardman-Blackstone ring. The operation yielded over $8.2 million in seized cash and fraudulent documents, 67 arrests, and the liberation of nearly 2,000 elderly victims from ongoing financial abuse. Agent Martinez led the charge from the Denver field office, with my support based on past experience tracking Hardman's patterns. Emma's digital forensic work played a critical role. Her findings traced financial transactions across state lines and tightened the net. The most gratifying arrest was that of Richard Blackstone himself, apprehended at his luxurious compound outside Las Vegas. The property was filled with high-end vehicles bought with money stolen from retirees across the western U.S. The man who had orchestrated Vivian's descent and tormented families like the Crosses and Petersons was finally facing federal charges that would keep him behind bars for good. When Agent Martinez informed me of Blackstone's capture, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't known since the day I stepped away from duty. Back in Maple Grove, the transformation was almost immediate. Just a week after Vivian's arrest, a sense of community began to blossom. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in ages were organizing block parties and starting community gardens. The Petersons threw a barbecue that brought together over 40 families, and not just to celebrate the end of their ordeal, but to mark the beginning of what Harold Peterson described as the first real community we've had in years. Mrs. Peterson, once silenced by fear, was elected president of the newly formed Maple Grove Mutual Aid Society, a group committed to fostering mutual support without manipulation or financial pressure, the exact opposite of Vivian's sham HOA. Because she cooperated with the investigation, Vivian was sentenced to 18 months of house arrest, 500 hours of community service, and ordered to fully repay those she defrauded. But what truly mattered was her public apology. Standing in the local park, tears streaking her cheeks, she said, "I hurt people I should have been protecting. Fear made me someone I never wanted to be. I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to make it right." Her son, Tommy, stood beside her, both committed to facing the consequences and starting over in Denver rather than running away. That night, as I looked around at a crowd of neighbors who were smiling and relaxed for the first time in years, I reflected on what genuine community leadership really meant. Real strength, I told them, doesn't come from fear or control or the ability to find people. It comes from neighbors trusting each other enough to speak out when something's wrong, and caring enough to listen when someone asks for help. Yet even in that moment of victory, I sensed that our journey wasn't over, because Emma had just discovered something in the file. The documents Emma uncovered hinted that the Hartman-Blackstone operation was only the tip of a far more dangerous iceberg. What landed in our mailbox a week later sent a chill through me, but it also confirmed that every risk we had taken was justified. Inside a plain, unmarked envelope were photographs, some of Emma taken in California 3 years ago, along with images of Tommy Cross and the Peterson family. Tucked between them was a typed note with a chilling message: "We never forget, and we always collect our debts." Agent Martinez's forensic team traced the materials back to an international crime syndicate, one so large and deeply connected that Hartman and Blackstone seemed like amateurs in comparison. What struck me hardest wasn't just the threat, it was how old the surveillance photos were. These people had been watching us long before Emma ever came to live with me. Her reaction floored me. No panic, no fear, just a steely calm that reminded me of myself back in the early days of the Bureau, but paired with a digital fluency I could have only dreamed of then. Spreading the photographs out across our kitchen table, she looked at me and said, "Grandpa, I've been digging into this network ever since we caught Blackstone. Over the past 5 years, 67 retired FBI agents have been stalked or harassed. It's the same group. They're not just running scams, they're going after the people who used to chase them." Her findings revealed something more terrifying than anything I'd encountered in 3 decades with the Bureau. And so we were faced with a choice: disappear into witness protection, or stand and fight. The Reeves family had never been one to run. Sitting together at the table, surrounded by federal security agents and stacks of relocation pamphlets, I said, "We have 2 choices. We can vanish into some safe house and spend our lives looking over our shoulders, or we can turn Maple Grove into the kind of place criminals know better than to mess with." Emma didn't hesitate for a second. "Grandpa, we've built a life here. These are our neighbors, our friends. This is our home. If some global syndicate thinks they can drive us out, they're about to find out how wrong they are." What followed was a transformation that would eventually make Maple Grove a national model, what the FBI later named the most crime-resistant neighborhood in Colorado. Over 6 months, I personally trained 23 residents in threat detection, communications, and the situational awareness tactics that had kept me alive in the field. Mrs. Peterson organized a 24/7 neighborhood watch schedule. Jake Sullivan built a secure, encrypted communication system that connected every home instantly. Tommy Cross became the link between older and younger residents, forming a multi-generational defense network stronger than anyone could have imagined. The most moving moment came when Vivian Cross, now serving her community service sentence, asked to speak at one of our meetings. "I spent 2 years turning all of you against one another," she admitted, standing before more than 40 families. "I made friends into strangers and neighbors into enemies. But watching what you've created here has shown me exactly what I tore apart and what I now have to dedicate my life to helping rebuild." When she finished, Harold Peterson stood and clapped. Then everyone else followed. Watching Emma grow into a confident leader was the most rewarding part of the entire experience. 6 months after the arrests, she earned a full-ride scholarship to Colorado State University to study cybersecurity. When the acceptance letter arrived, she hugged me and said, "I used to think courage meant never being afraid, but you taught me that real courage is feeling terrified and still doing what's right. And when people stand together like we have, there's nothing we can't face." The ultimate test came 8 months after Vivian's arrest. 2 black SUVs rolled slowly into Maple Grove, creeping through the streets like wolves sizing up prey. But this time, they didn't find fear. Within moments, 12 neighbors stepped outside, each equipped with cameras and secure communication gear. Others immediately contacted federal authorities. Within minutes, the SUVs turned around and left, clearly realizing that Maple Grove was no longer a place they could intimidate. That evening, standing on my front lawn, I watched neighbors exchange greetings with the kind of warmth that only comes from surviving hardship together. And I understood something profound. The strength that had protected us didn't come from law enforcement titles or badges. It came from regular people who chose to trust each other and to fight for something bigger than themselves. Later, when Agent Martinez called about a similar case in Oregon where elderly residents were being harassed by a criminal ring, Emma didn't even wait for my input. "Grandpa, she said. What if we helped teach other neighborhoods what we've learned here? Our story began with one neighbor's attempts to control and terrorize an entire community. But it ended with the realization that true power lies in unity when people stand together, especially when standing alone just isn't enough. Maple Grove became proof that ordinary people, armed with trust, purpose, and a little training, could stand up to even the darkest threats. Have you ever felt powerless against corrupt HOAs, bullies, or fraudsters threatening your peace of mind? This story is proof regular people can fight back and win. If you believe in protecting your community from predators, make sure to like and subscribe to Ya Stories for more real tales of justice and empowerment. Thanks for sticking with us through this story. You made it through with your sanity, mostly, intact. This is Ya's Story, powered by Cafe Tilde, copyright Floa and editorial crew that's seen way too much of suburban drama. See you in the next neighborhood showdown.